Dear learners, today I will be talking about international environmental law, policies and treaties. This is a part of the course MEV 003. I am Professor Bhaskar from School of Sciences, Indira Gandhi National Open University. What is environmental law? International environmental law is a study of global environmental issues. Now, whatever debates are going on in this are based on a number of international treaties and declarations. In fact, international environmental law is a component of environmental law that governs state to state relationship. Now, from where does this environmental law is derived? The most important is the customary international law. Customary international law are norms that most countries follow, and that is the basis of all that follows. In general, the law followed by civilized nation, general principles of law are also sources of international law. In addition, there are subsidiary sources of international law can include any court or tribunal decisions as well as jurist writing. Now, a plethora of legally binding international agreements address a wide range of environmental issues. If you see the international agreements, they cover a wide range of topics: terrestrial area, marine, atmospheric protection, biodiversity, etc. And most of them are multilateral in nature. And what are protocols? They are secondary agreements based on the primary treaty. Now, protocols are available in a variety of international law subsets. They have practical application in environmental issues. Now, the advantage of protocol is that they make it possible to incorporate recent scientific advances. For example, all of you know the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is followed by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, this is one of the famous protocol. Similarly, you have Montreal Protocol. Now, United Nations Conference on Human Environment, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and the World Summit on Sustainable Development all had significant impacts. These are the three important international conferences which was in 1972, 1992 and 2002. Multilateral environmental agreements also result in formation of international organization with clearly defined roles. So, whenever these agreements are there, there can be international bodies which are formed and they have clear defined roles. Now, international organization, the job of these is to oversee that the agreement which has been done is put into action. For example, these agreements resulted in Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, popularly known as CITES, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So, these are the agencies which oversee the implementation. The opinion of international courts and tribunal provide the background of international law. Whatever international courts and tribunals decide, that forms the basis. The declaration, codes and guidelines are considered soft law. There is a soft law and there is a hard law. Soft law means they are not binding. Now, soft laws are formed for various reasons. Lack of consensus in arriving at a universal law, that is one of the reasons. Then lack of a supreme body for making law. Then there can be diverse cultures, religion, etc., which may inhibit making a uniform law. However, soft laws are very useful as they can facilitate collective action by states when required without restricting their freedom of action. This is the beauty of soft law, is that they just allow the nations the freedom of their action within the framework what they can do. The first important conference which was held in International Conference in Environment was the Stockholm Conference. Now, this conference, the idea was mooted by Sweden in United Nations Economic and Social Council in the year 68. Once in 68, Sweden proposed this council, the General Assembly in 1969 decided to hold the conference in 72. This was the first event where all the nations came together, and General Assembly proposed that this conference should result in stimulating and providing guidelines for action by national government and international organization. That means the aim of the conference was to provide some guidelines. And if you see this Stockholm conference, this was backed by 115 governments, and this background preparation lasted for about 4 years. And Stockholm, Sweden hosted the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in June 1972. This was the first conference, international environmental conference with international environmental issues with complete backing of the UN. This was a big event in environmental sciences because this marked a major milestone in international environmental politics. Now, what the conference agreed upon is a declaration about environment and development. They gave about 26 principles. Then a clear-cut plan of action, 109 recommendations. And they also passed resolution to financial and institutional arrangements. The Stockholm Resolution obviously supported the pre-Stockholm treaties and conventions relating to marine pollutions, transboundary air pollution, endangered species, etc. Now, the action plan dealing with creation of institution and cooperation among existing ones, it also gave an action plan for the international community. The conference gave 26 principles which are very important. Now, what are those 26 principles? And they are the basis of all further development which has taken place. Fundamental right to freedom, equality and adequate conditions of life in an environment of a quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. This is the first condition, that the environment should be of quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. Then there should be intergenerational equity between generations, maintenance and restoration and improvement of renewable resources. That is very important, and appeal to the people to manage the environment to avoid irreversible damage to the ecosystem. In other words, it appeals for people participation in these principles. Now, it was the first conference which recognized the relationship between economic, social and environmental development. It also encouraged the development through transfer of technology and financial aid to developing countries. The states should cooperate in developing international environmental law. The states should adopt and implement suitable environmental standards. These were the 26 principles which are very important. The international organizations should coordinate in such activities that facilitate better environment. In fact, the foundations were laid after the Stockholm Conference. The UN General Assembly considered the report submitted by Stockholm Conference and recommended the development of environmental related standards and activities at all levels, be it regional, national or global level. Now, this led to the development of a precursor to the formation of an international organization through UNEP. This directed the future course of environmental policies in Europe and elsewhere. However, Stockholm Conference did not result in the adoption of binding legal obligations for the state parties. They were just guidelines. This is important. The next conference which was held was 20 years after Stockholm Conference. Stockholm Conference was held in 72. This was after 20 years, and in 1992 this was conducted, and the main objective of the Rio Conference was to stop the environmental degradation of the planet. One of the most important thing following the Stockholm Conference was UN in the year 1983 set up a commission on environment and development, and this was led by Brundtland from Norway. And this commission made a very, very important contribution. They gave the concept of sustainable development. Now, what is sustainable development? It is the development which meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. This formed the basis of the concept of sustainable development. Based on Brundtland Report 1987, the UN General Assembly called for the Convention of United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, popularly known as UNCED. Now, this was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in June 1992, and it was represented by 172 governments, several government and several non-government agencies and international agencies also participated in this conference. Now, it focused on balancing the development that support economic development and avoids damage to the environment. In other words, it wanted to promote development without damage to the environment. It stressed the need to bring about global partnership to tackle the issues. This was the first conference where they decided that we should have a global approach to these kind of problems. Now, the issues addressed in Rio conference included the following. For example, there was a comprehensive study of production patterns which included toxic components such as lead in gasoline, toxic waste and radioactive chemicals. Also, energy source was important, the use of other sources of energy replacing fossil fuels. You can see that in 1992 itself we thought of replacing fossil fuels because climate change is essentially caused due to the carbon which is there or fossil fuels. Promoting the use of public transportation system. This conference made this recommendation. This will not only reduce the vehicular emissions, congestion in cities and associated health risks. Today we are reading that air pollution is causing a lot of health damage. So in 1992 this conference recognized the importance. Then another important factor is the demands and diminishing water availability. There is a scarcity of water availability, scarcity of water, and water quality is also of concern. So this conference addressed these issues. Now, this conference came with three important non-binding instruments. They are important, non-binding, that means they are not legally binding. That is Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, Agenda 21 and Forest Principles. Let me tell you, this formed the basis of many of the judgments which took place. Now, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development contains 27 principles. The unique feature was to maintain the balance of priority of developed and developing countries. It also gave guidelines regarding principles of sustainable development. So, this conference clearly tried to see that the priorities of developed and developing countries are different and they need to be supported. Though this is a form of soft law, legal implications is immense as many treaties, protocols, regulations and judicial decisions were based on this. Even now, the International Court and several courts refer to these kind of guidelines to help to deliver judgments. Now, for example, the adoption of forestry principles led to the revision of International Timber Trade Agreement in 1994. This was the first legal consensus reached on forest. Now, it posed responsibility on the countries through reforestation and forest conservation. At the same time, they were given liberty to develop the forest depending on their socio-economic needs. The most important among this was Agenda 21. Now, Agenda 21 is a dynamic program and a voluntary action plan. It is called Agenda 21 because it is to be achieved in the 21st century. The proposed action will enable the transition to sustainable development in the 21st century. Now, this is a comprehensive blueprint for local, national, regional and global actions. This was adopted by 178 countries at the Rio conference. It comprises 40 chapters and hundreds of program areas. Now, this agenda lays down ways and means in which reduction of wasteful and inefficient consumption patterns can be done. It recognized the need of developed countries like extending financial support. This is an important aspect. Aiding technological transfer to developing countries to achieve sustainable development. So, this Agenda 21 recognizes that developing countries need to be supported in terms of technology and finance by developed countries. Now, some important agreements took place which were legally binding: Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and then Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, major outcome of the summit was an agreement on Climate Convention. This resulted in the formation of Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Today we know how important this climate change is, and the basis was laid in this Rio conference. Now, there were some important agreements. The Convention on Biodiversity was signed at Earth Summit. This is a very important convention on CBD which was signed. It emphasized that natural ecoregion should be protected and we should avoid economically unsustainable growth. Despite its success of Rio conferences, many agreements made in Rio, such as fighting poverty and cleaning up our environment, are yet to be accomplished. This is an ongoing process. You can see the next important treaty was the Johannesburg Treaty, and the World Summit on Sustainable Development was held at Johannesburg, South Africa, from 26th August to 4th September 2002. So, again this was held after 10 years after Rio, and that is why this is also called Rio plus 10. And this summit brought together several leaders from business and non-governmental organizations. So, the goal of WSSD was to hold a 10-year review of the 1992 UNCED to invigorate global commitments to sustainable development. In other words, it was to see what was the achievement after 1992 and how we can infuse more energy into the action. The main outcome of this summit was the plan of WSSD plan of implementations, and there were several partnerships were launched to help implement commitments made at WSSD. Now, what is the plan of implementation? It is conceived as a framework to implement the sustainable development originally agreed at 1992. What was agreed? They decided to form a framework. The plan contains chapters on the following. And if you see the sustainable development goals, they also include the same. Millennium development goals, they also broadly include the same. The chapters are poverty eradication, consumption and production, natural resource base, health, small island developing states, Africa, other regional initiatives, means of implementation, and institutional framework. The plan of implementation contains over 30 targets, the majority of which has been established in the Millennium Declaration. So, these are the basic things which they decided in this conference. Now, the most significant targets which they wanted to achieve was to halve the number, it gave some quantification, to halve the number of world's poor living on less than $1 per day by 2015, significantly improve the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. In other words, for each goal, there was a deadline set to halve the population of people without drinking water by 2015, to halve the proportion of people without access to sanitation by 2015, cease destructive fishing practices, maintain fish stocks, and phase out chemicals detrimental to health impact by 2020, significantly reduce biodiversity loss by 2010. So, what was important here is significant targets were set and deadlines were established, some kind of quantification was attempt was made. Now, the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development did not set out international principle that could be invoked in legal or political context. It was not binding, but it was a philosophical contextualization for more detailed commitments in the plan of implementation. They wanted to have a more human, equitable and caring global society. It highlights the integration of economic development, social development and environmental protection, the three pillars of sustainable development. It obviously emphasized the need to eradicate poverty, change production and consumption pattern, and protect and manage the natural resource base. The declaration reaffirmed the Millennium Development Goals and welcomes decision taken at WSSD on targets, timetables and partnership to improve access to clean water, sanitation, energy, healthcare, food and protect biodiversity. These are the important goals which any nation or international community has to achieve. It also emphasized the need for financial resources for developing countries to be supported by developed countries. It also supported the transfer of technology. It also supported the private sector to enforce accountability. It also addressed issues like armed conflict, terrorism, intolerance, combating communicable and chronic diseases. Finally, declaration reaffirms all countries' commitment to UN Charter and international law, and what was important, it called for strengthening the multilateralism and pledges to have an inclusive process involving all groups. The next important achievement was voluntary partnership. Large number of between countries, international institutions, private sectors, NGOs, they formed voluntary partnerships. More than 300 partnerships were launched at the summit, including 32 energy initiatives, 21 major water programs and for biodiversity and ecosystem management. This was a big achievement of this conference. Some legislations of international importance are sites other than these main conferences: Vienna Convention, Montreal Protocol, Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm Convention on POP, Basel Convention, Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. Now, what is sites? The increase in trade of life forms and their products for commercial purposes beyond frontiers has been one of the major cause of decline in biodiversity. So, to prevent trade in life forms, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, was convened. This is again a multilateral treaty that protects endangered plants and animals. This treaty was drafted as a result of deliberations held at IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, in 1963, and this convention was opened for signature in 1973. This CITES came into existence on 1st July 1975. The primary objective was to curb the international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants in order to protect the survival of species in the wild. Now, again, participation by member states to join this treaty is voluntary, but once they join, they have to take certain steps as prescribed in the treaty. Now, these nations which have come together are bound by the convention are known as parties. Convention is legally binding on parties, but does not replace existing national laws. This is very important. Though it is legally binding, it does not take the place of national laws. It only provides broad guidelines, and nations must design their own domestic laws to implement CITES. CITES Secretariat is administered by UNEP and is located in Geneva, Switzerland, and all activities related to the convention are coordinated by this office. Now, CITES, the limitations is it focuses on trade at species level. That means it only focuses on trade, not on what you do within a country. Unfortunately, it does not deal with ecosystem approaches to the conservation or destruction of the habitat. It does nothing about the ecosystem preservation or destruction. CITES only protects charismatic species, megafauna or animals with high market value. So, that means only certain species get the importance. CITES controls their trade. It does nothing regarding the hunting or killing of animals. Nevertheless, this is important as it regulates trade of exotic species. Now, the next important convention was the Vienna Convention, and this Vienna conference was held in 1985 for the protection of ozone layer. And this is again a multilateral environmental agreement and came into force in 1988. It is one of the most successful environmental treaties ratified by 197 states as well as European Union. This is quoted as one of the most successful stories. The objectives of the convention were to facilitate cooperation by research and information effects on the effects of human activities on the ozone layer. It also aimed to adopt legislative or administrative measures against activities likely to have adverse effect on ozone layer. It formed the basis for international effort to save the ozone layer. Now, the protocol which was formed was the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete ozone layer is an international treaty for the protection of ozone layer, a protocol to the Vienna Convention for protection of ozone layer. Obviously, its objectives were phasing out the production of ozone depleting substances. It was agreed upon on 16 September 1987. That is why we have the Ozone Day and Ozone Week during this time. It came into force on 1st January 1989, and then since then it has undergone several revisions. The ultimate aim is reduction in production of CFCs itself, not just emission of CFCs. That means to ban production, and parties are expected to reduce their consumption and production to the 1986 level, which is considered to be as base year. Again, Montreal Protocol is one of the most successful environmental treaties, and it shows if nations come together, they can do lot of things for the environment. Rotterdam Convention is the convention on prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade. Again, this controls the transboundary movement of certain hazardous substance. Then we had Stockholm Convention on POP. Again, this was signed in 2001. This is the persistent organic chemicals, and they can bioaccumulate and cause damage. So, this again main feature is that developed countries provide additional financial resources, new and technological resources to eliminate production and use of intentionally produced POPs, that is the persistent organic pollutants. The important one, another one is the Basel Convention, which is the international treaty that controls transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. This again is regulated. And then the last one I would like to talk upon is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, is an international agreement on biosafety. It is a supplement to the Convention on Biodiversity and effective since 2003, and this aims to protect biodiversity from potential threats resulting from genetically modified organisms. The protocol outlines the precautionary principles that should be applied to the products that result from modern biotechnology. Now, thank you very much for very patient listening.